The fifth round of the 2006 IndyCar Series season would take place on the winding upstate New York asphalt of Watkins, Glen. Entering this race, while there were some good storylines of note to come out of the previous 4 races, there was really only one of note for just about everybody in the paddock that day. 1 week prior at the Indy 500, history had been made in a thrilling finish between race winner Sam Hornish Jr. and second place finisher Marco Andretti. But as much as I was at the forefront of people's memories, the weather at Watkins Glen this weekend was at the forefront of people's minds. All throughout the weekend, it was cold, rainy, and rather dreary for that matter. Thanks to the poor weather on Sunday morning, qualifying would be cancelled and the starting grid would be set by the practice results from Friday. Championship points leader Helio Castroneves would start from the pole, with Tony Kanaan joining him to complete an all-Brazilian front row. Our 2 main protagonists from the Indy 500 of Marco Andretti and Sam Hornish Jr. would start this race in 3rd and 6th respectively. Ryan Briscoe, in his return to IndyCar following his crash at Chicagoland the year prior, would start this race in 10th. Felipe Giafoni would be our 19th and last place starter. But really, the starting grid was just a loose template for the race that lied ahead. For the first time in the 10-year history of the Indy Racing League up to this point, we'd be racing in the wet. Sure, the IRL didn't run a road course race until 2005, but it was still a big moment regardless. Before we get into this race, allow me, if you would, to share the dorkiest command that I think I've ever heard.
Please welcome TISO Executive Phil Grieco.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's cold outside, but the drivers are about to heat things up. So without further ado, drivers, start your engines!
With that taken care of, we can now get to the start of the race. The green flag flies and the drivers are on their way, and with a sweeping move around the outside, Tony Kanaan would jump into the race lead with just about everybody behind trying to keep it on the road and keeping it single file. Outside of that and a slight amount of shuffling though, lap 1 was rather tame. However, by the end of that first lap, we already had racers throwing haymakers with a bout of 3 wide racing between Marco, Hornish, and Scott Dixon. Rather early on into the race though, the track was starting to dry up quite quickly, with the whole field looking to find any bit of wetness to cool off their tires. We even had some drivers switching to slicks, and by some, I mean Thomas Scheckter. See, it might be down to the fact that Thomas Scheckter was a subject of one of my first ever IndyCar history videos from 4 years ago, but that right there is a perfectly on-brand move for a guy like Scheckter. It may have been a little bit premature though, as he struggled for the first few laps out of the pits. However, as soon as Scheckter got those tires up to temp and clocked in the fastest lap of the race, it sent a flurry of racers into pit lane. It started with Sam Hornish Jr. on lap 8, with practically everybody following in suit the lap after that. As this was going on, Danica Patrick suffered a Code Brown moment coming out of the pits, driving away with a new set of slick tires and probably a slightly warmer fire suit. With a gamble to come in for wets earlier than everybody else, the pit cycle had shot Scheckter all the way up to 5th, which, while impressive, wasn't nearly as shocking as the fact that rookie Jeff Simmons had stayed out on wets and was now leading the race. Simmons had gone off to a rather costly start to the season with a flip in Motegi and a crash at Indy. His team's crew had even said to him right before the start of the race to just bring the car home in one piece. Shortly after coming in for slick, Simmons would loop it coming out of turn number 1 and hit the wall, bringing out the first caution of the race 10 laps in. The yellow would be brief, and shortly thereafter we'd get the race restarted with Thomas Scheckter now cycling out to the lead. The whole field was now on slicks, with a green flag coming back out in perfect time for the rain to come back as well. The restart would prove to not be a very good one for Sam Hornish as he spun coming out of turn number 7. Nobody would make any contact with him, but it would bring the yellow back out. Once Hornish got refired, the race was set to get back up and rolling on lap 16 with Scheckter still up at the front. The field was rather feverish as the race got restarted, with 3 wide racing involving Dario Franchitti, Marco Andretti, and Scott Dixon. But 3 wide racing in slick conditions down to the bus stop is never going to work as Dario slid off the track with Marco nearly following in suit. The broadcast though just didn't catch this for whatever reason. They talked about the save from Marco but somehow completely missed Dario Franchitti sliding off the track to Timbuktu. Marty Reed and Scott Goodyear were just completely oblivious as to what happened and seemed quite confused when they showed his car stopped in the gravel. There was one person who caught it in the booth, and it was Rusty Wallace in his 1 year commentating IndyCar for ABC. Buddy Rice had a moment of his own heading off into the bus stop, which would bring the yellow out. Under this yellow, I figured I'd filibuster real quick and add in a sidecar to that talk from a couple of moments ago. This is probably a controversial opinion, but despite having never raced, driven, or frankly cared about IndyCar before in his life, Rusty Wallace was the only redeeming quality about this ABC booth. Considering the trend in recent moments, it's not a shock to say that the drama came back even quicker on the lap 20 restart, with Danica Patrick spinning and hitting the outside wall after getting tapped by Eddie Cheever, followed shortly thereafter by Kotsuke Matsura spinning out of the first turn and taking a wild ride into the wall and ending up in the air as he collected Jeff Simmons. Both Matsura and Simmons would be out of the race as a result of their incident. Under this yellow, a flurry of pit stops would come around for the likes of Kanaan, Dixon, and others on the first go-around, and then race leader Thomas Scheckter shortly thereafter. This would give the lead of the race off to Dan Weldon and promote Brian Herta and Eddie Cheever up into the top 3 as well. Restart number 4 would come on lap 25, and fortunately we would finally settle this race into any form of groove. Now that doesn't mean it was tame though, as we had all sorts of battling going on. The main action at this point in time was around Marco, as he was going for some rather gutsy moves, including a dive into turn number 1 which nearly took out Eddie Cheever. At the halfway mark of the race, Dan Weldon was still the race leader. At the end of lap 35, we'd get the latest round of stops underway, with Dan Weldon coming into the pits after a nearly 28 lap long stint. However, he was a bit of an outlier, and for pretty much everybody else, the pit stops would be coming a little bit farther along. But as we got closer to that pit window, the 5th yellow of the race would come out. Coming out of turn number 8, Marco Andretti tried to go for a pretty bold move on Eddie Cheever. Eddie would rather absent-mindedly drive over to the right-hand side and make contact with Marco, who would take a one-way trip into the outside tire wall. The incident would bring to an end the longest green flag run of the race and take both Andretti and Cheever out of it. Michael Andretti was rather fiery in his interview shortly after the crash for his son, describing Eddie as a waste who did it on purpose and shouldn't be allowed on the racetrack, a sentiment which seemed to be shared by Marco. It simply would not be a Marco crash if Michael wasn't ready to tear flesh from bone. Under this yellow, the pit stops came, and it proved to be a rather disastrous cycle for Helio Castroneves, who would have a painfully slow stop and drop down like a stone thrown into a pond. It wasn't as bad as Dan Weldon, though, who broke a drive shaft trying to pull away from a stall and would thus be out of the race. In all this drama, Buddy Rice would shuffle out to the race lead. The race would once again restart on lap 47, where all hell broke loose, with Dario Franchitti and Thomas Scheckter going off into turn number 1, and Brian Herta getting clipped following a dive from Tony Kanaan. Kanaan would snap his front wing, while Herta would pick up a rear puncture. Shortly before the second incident though, Scott Dixon would jump out into the race lead over Rice. And this would prove to be doubly important, as it became quite clear that the race would come down to the 2-hour time limit. That fact certainly became prevalent when the rain started to come back in a rather big way, which eventually led to Kanaan spinning and hitting the wall coming out of turn number 8. Helio Castroneves had a moment of his own coming out of turn number 1 around the same time. But because of the Kanaan incident, the yellow was out once again. With less than 10 minutes to go on the clock, the field was puttering around under yellow, barely able to keep the cars on track on slick tires. But with such little time left in the race, it was just a big game of chicken to see who could tough it out on dry tires. With a wet track and slick tires, the race would get restarted on lap 52, but less than a lap later, a spin for Thomas Scheckter would bring the yellow out with only 4 minutes left on the clock. The safety crews would work their magic though, giving us a one-lap shootout for the win. However, as it turns out, there was nothing that anybody could do to challenge Scott Dixon, who would come out of the final corner to win the 2006 Watkins Glen Indy Grand Prix. Vitor Meira, racing in a nearly sponsorless Panther racing car, would come home in second, with Ryan Briscoe in his series return running at your podium in third. This race was absolute madness from start to finish. Everything down to the strategy content in this race was exciting, and of course the drama out there on the racetrack helps it along too. That sort of race, the kind of cold, rainy race where the skies are gray and the drivers are seeing red, are always such an enjoyable one to watch from my perspective. There's definitely a little bit of nostalgia involved in that, but that's probably a subject for another day. There was so much stuff out of this race as well that I couldn't even talk about in this video, so honestly, if you've got a spare 1 hour and 47 minutes, check this race out for yourself. And praise be relief for this being my first IndyCar race review since May of 2024. Good lord, it's been a long time. I hope you enjoyed that race just as much as I did. I would love to hear what some of y'all's thoughts are in the comments section. Thank you all for watching and have a great afternoon.